I will begin with a confession that would sound unremarkable in a department lounge. Another scholar with insomnia, another mind that refuses to turn off, except that mine did not merely keep me awake. It built me libraries. For years, every night without fail, I went to bookstores in my dreams. Not one bookstore, not an incoherent blur of aisles that collapsed as soon as I tried to read a spine. No, 5, sometimes 6, always the same, arranged in a sequence as dependable as a syllabus. I could have drawn their floor plans from memory the way a sailor draws coastlines. I knew the curvature of their shelves the way a blind man knows the bend of a familiar hallway, not with sight alone, but with the body's certainty, with the private mathematics of touch and expectation. I knew the people who attended. I knew the reference librarians, and like any patron who becomes a fixture, I was tolerated with that peculiar combination of warmth and suspicion reserved for those who do not browse so much as hunt. The bookstores of the night. In the waking world, the term bookstore suggests commerce, a register, the soft humiliation of price stickers. In the world I visited after midnight, bookstore was simply the word my mind used for a place where books gathered. The dream bookstores had reading tables, catalogue terminals that hummed like beehives, reference desks with little brass lamps, and librarians whose patience felt infinite but not indulgent, more like the patience of stone. They were not whimsical in the way dreams are supposed to be. They were consistent. I could return after a month and find the same crack in a banister, the same smudge on a map, the same creak in the third floorboard from the left. The first I always entered was the arcade. The arcade was long and narrow, like a converted train platform. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the shelves ran parallel with the precision of teeth. There was always a draft, as if the place were connected to a system of tunnels. I used to think the draft was a dream's attempt at atmosphere until I realized it had direction. It pulled you forward. You could stand at the entrance and feel it tugging at your coat, urging you deeper among the stacks. The reference librarian there was a man with round spectacles and a cardigan that never changed color, some shade between moss and dust. I never learned his name, though I heard others call him Mr. Klein with a familiar affection. In my dreams, names were like call numbers, useful, conditional, sometimes wrong. Mr. Klein never smiled. He did not need to. He knew me the way a library knows a regular patron, by the rhythm of my footsteps, by my habits, by the question I had not yet asked. The second bookstore was the conservatory. The conservatory was a greenhouse of books, glass ceiling, condensation in the corners, a faint smell of soil and ink. The shelves there were not straight. They bowed outward like ribs, curving in a way that made every aisle feel like the inside of a creature. When I walked those aisles, I felt I was being held or measured. At the conservatory's reference desk sat a woman with hair pinned in a tidy coil and hands perpetually stained with graphite. She wore no jewelry except a ring that looked like a thin band of blackened silver. She always greeted me with a nod, as if our acquaintance were a professional arrangement. She answered questions by sliding index cards across the desk. On them she would write not the title I sought, but the adjacent titles, the books that touched the book, the books that shadowed it, the books that might mislead me into thinking I had found what I wanted. I began to suspect she was less a guide than a test. The third bookstore was the cartographer's shop. This one was my favorite for a long time, before obsession narrowed my tastes. The cartographer's shop smelled of vellum and salt. Maps hung from the ceiling like banners. Globes rolled lazily in corners, as if the world were something you could set down and pick up again. There were books there that did not merely describe places, but insisted on them. Atlases that contained cities no longer extant. Gazetteers that listed towns I felt I had lived in, briefly, in childhood dreams. If I opened a map in that shop, I would sometimes find, tucked between two pages, a thin strip of paper like a bookmark, with a call number written in an unfamiliar hand. Those slips made my chest tighten. They felt like clues left by someone who knew I would come. The librarian there was a tall person, sometimes man, sometimes woman, sometimes neither, as if the dream were incapable of committing. Their voice never rose above a whisper. They spoke as one might speak in the presence of sleeping animals. The fourth bookstore was the Ash Annex. It was always dim. The ash annex looked like it had survived a fire long ago and decided to keep the evidence. The walls were stained the color of old smoke. The books, miraculously unburned, had a faint odor of charcoal. The shelves were blackened wood, and when I ran my fingers along them, soot came away on my skin. The patrons there were different from the others. They did not browse. They sat at tables with books open like wounds and stared at the pages without turning them. When I passed, they did not look up. It was as if they had already found what they came for and were paying the price of it. The reference librarian in the ash annex was an elderly woman with hair like a white cloud and eyes that seemed too bright for the dimness. She wore a lanyard with keys that clinked softly when she moved. If I asked her a question, she would answer with another question, and if I persisted, she would glance over my shoulder as if checking whether the stacks themselves were listening. The fifth bookstore, sometimes the last, sometimes merely the penultimate, was the roundabout. The roundabout was circular, perfectly, unnervingly so. The shelves formed rings, concentric and seamless, as if carved from a single piece of wood that had been persuaded into circles. There were no corners, no hidden alcoves, no places for shadows to accumulate. The effect was not comforting, it was coercive. The circle insisted that you return, that you orbit. In the roundabout, I could close my eyes and walk to any shelf by counting steps. I knew the subtle variations in the floorboard spring. I knew where the air was cooler, where it smelled faintly of oranges, where it carried a metallic tang like old coins. The reference desk was placed at the exact center, and the librarian there, always the same, sat with a posture so straight it seemed painful. He was young, perhaps my age, with dark hair and a face that suggested he had never been surprised. His name, I learned early, was Hollis. It was written on a brass nameplate in crisp serif letters, the kind used in real institutions. "Back again," he would say, not accusing, not pleased. "Yes," I would answer always, and then inevitably I would begin the nightly hunt. Sometimes there was a sixth bookstore, the Bridge. The Bridge was not always present. It appeared like an extra chapter, a postscript. It was a bookstore built on a bridge over black water. The shelves were narrow, and the wind threatened to tear pages from open books. The librarian there was more a silhouette than a person, and whenever I visited, I felt an urgency that bordered on panic, as if this shop existed only briefly, and if I missed it, something would close behind me. But the five were constant. The five were my circuit. I moved through them the way a monk moves through prayers, not because I expected the words to change, but because repetition itself was the mechanism. The trouble, as anyone who has spent too much time among books can tell you, is that repetition is how obsession trains you. Second, the favorite shelf. In every dream bookstore, there were shelves that interested me and shelves that did not. My mind, like any mind, had its biases. It stocked my dreams with the subjects I loved: medieval commentaries, obscure historiographies, forgotten pamphlets, translations of translations. In the cartographer's shop, the maps called to me like sirens. In the conservatory, I was drawn toward natural histories whose illustrations seemed to move if I stared too long. But in the roundabout, there was a shelf, one shelf, that became my anchor. It was not marked. It had no placard indicating genre or classification. It was simply, to my nightly self, the shelf. It sat on the third ring from the center, at a point that would correspond, if the building had cardinal directions, to the west. I knew its location by instinct. My feet would carry me there even when I told myself I would do something different that night. The shelf had a particular curvature that my hands remembered, a slight outward bow, like the shelf was swelling with the weight of its books. If I placed my palm flat against it, I could feel the faint vibration of something, air, perhaps, or the dream's own machinery. On that shelf, among books that varied slightly from night to night, there was always a spine I recognized, a black spine, gold lettering, a title so familiar it had begun to feel like part of my biography. Catalogue of the Night Libraries. No author's name, no publisher, no date, just the title, stamped in gold that did not tarnish. The first time I saw it, I felt the mild thrill of recognition that accompanies any bibliographic anomaly. Scholars are trained to notice what does not fit. The misfiled text, the odd edition, the book that should not exist in a particular place. We are, if we are honest, drawn to errors the way detectives are drawn to bloodstains. I reached for it in the dream and pulled it free. It was heavier than it looked. The cover was cool, as if it had been kept in a cellar. When I opened it, I expected— what? An index, perhaps, a list, something that could be read, copied, cited. Instead, the pages were filled with tables. Not tables in the sense of furniture, but tables of information, columns and rows, call numbers and shelf locations, annotations in a tiny typeface that stung my eyes. Each entry seemed to describe a library that did not exist in the waking world. The library of unfinished letters, the archive of unsent messages, the reading room of forgotten names. Some entries were in English, some in Spanish, some in Latin, some in alphabets I could not place. And the most disorienting part was that the catalogue did not remain stable. If I looked away and looked back, the entries shifted, as if the book were being continuously revised by unseen hands. I tried to copy an entry once, just one, to anchor myself. I found a pencil in my pocket, a miracle of preparedness, and leaned over the page. I began to write down a call number. When I looked at my notebook, the numbers were wrong, or rather, they were correct in my hand, but did not correspond to anything on the page. It was as if the book refused to be transcribed. The next morning, waking at my usual hour, I remembered the title, but not the entries. The way you remember the shape of a dream, but not its content. I told myself it did not matter. Dreams were an internal theater. Their props were made of vapor. But I went back the next night, and there it was again, on the same shelf, with the same gold title. Night after night I found it. Sometimes I opened it and tried to read. Sometimes I simply held it, feeling its weight. Sometimes I did nothing but stare at it, as if the act of recognition were enough. Hollis, the librarian at the center desk, began to watch me more closely. One night, after I had returned the book to its place for the 100th time, he said, "You keep choosing that one." "It keeps being there," I replied. "That is not an answer. It's the only constant." He leaned back slightly in his chair. "No," he said, "it is not the only constant. You are the constant." "Are you suggesting," I asked, irritated by the implication, "that I'm stocking your shelves?" His expression did not change. "I am suggesting," he said, "that you should be careful what you call yours." The dream shifted then, as dreams do, and I found myself in the conservatory, my hands damp with condensation, my mind buzzing with the librarian's words. Be careful what you call yours. It was, I told myself, simply the kind of aphorism a dream invents to sound profound. I had read enough Borges, enough of those labyrinths made of mirrors and infinite shelves, to recognize the voice of my own literary influences. Of course, my subconscious would dress itself in that costume. And yet the book remained, night after night, with the stubbornness of a fact. It began to haunt my waking hours. When I walked through campus, my mind would drift toward that black spine, as if it were a lighthouse. When I sat in seminars, listening to colleagues discuss texts that existed solidly in the world, I felt an impatience that embarrassed me. What were these real books compared to the dream book that refused to be real? I began to suspect I had crossed an invisible line, that my bibliophilia, the love of books, that harmless affection we academics romanticize, had begun to shade into something darker. Bibliomania is not, as people assume, simply the collecting of books. It is a fever, a compulsion, a conviction that salvation, identity, and meaning are bound in paper and ink, and that without a particular volume one is incomplete. I had always laughed at bibliomaniacs. I had written, with smug detachment, about 19th century collectors who ruined themselves to acquire first editions. I had admired their devotion and pitied their foolishness. Now, I began to understand them. Not by sympathy, but by contagion. Third, the day the dream walked into Doe. I'm a scholar at UC Berkeley. That fact is not the kind of detail one expects in a dream narrative, but it matters because libraries are not generic to me. They are my habitat. I know the institutional smell of Doe Memorial Library, marble dust and old paper, a faint hint of cleaning solution that never quite eradicates the past. I know the hush of the North Reading Room, the way whispers cling to the high ceilings. I know the stack's particular claustrophobia, the way the air seems thicker between shelves, as if laden with decades of unspoken thought. The morning it happened, I had woken from the roundabout with the title ringing in my skull as if stamped there, Catalogue of the Night Libraries. I showered, dressed, and walked to campus with an irritability that came from having dreamed too vividly. The world seemed flatter than it should, less textured than the spaces behind my eyelids. I told myself I would not think about it. I told myself I would go to Doe, find the article I needed for a seminar, and act like a reasonable adult. In the lobby, students clustered like birds around the entrance. Someone had taped a flyer to a column advertising a poetry reading. The ordinary life of the university went on, oblivious to my nocturnal adventures. I climbed the stairs. I nodded at the guard. I entered the stacks. The stacks are, in waking life, a kind of maze that pretends it isn't. The aisles are labeled, the floors numbered, the call ranges posted. But anyone who has spent time searching for a specific book knows the stack's capacity for misdirection. A book can be a few feet away and still be invisible, hidden by a misshelving, a missing volume, the sheer density of spines. I went to retrieve a mundane text, a commentary on medieval marginalia, because of course it was. I navigated by habit, turning left where my body expected to turn left, ascending a staircase I could climb in the dark, and then on an impulse that felt like a tug at the back of my neck, I turned down an aisle I had no reason to enter. I slowed. There was a shelf halfway down the aisle that curved slightly outward. In waking life, shelves do not curve. They sag, perhaps under weight, but they do not curve with intention. This shelf had the same subtle bow I knew from the roundabout. It was as if a piece of my dream's geometry had been smuggled into the library. I stepped closer, my heart doing something irritatingly dramatic in my chest. There, between two volumes of obscure criticism, sat a black spine with gold lettering. Catalogue of the Night Libraries. For a moment I truly believed I was asleep. The stacks around me seemed to waver, as if they might dissolve into the circular aisles of the roundabout. I half expected Hollis to appear at the end of the aisle, watching with that neutral expression. But the air was too dry, the fluorescent lights too harsh, the distant sound of a cart rolling too real. I reached out. My fingers touched the spine. It was cool, not cold, not room temperature, cool, like stone in shade. The gold letters did not gleam like foil. They seemed embedded, as if the title were part of the material itself. I pulled. The book slid out with the same weight I remembered. Heavier than it looked, the kind of weight that suggests not merely paper, but responsibility. My breath came quick. I looked at the cover, black, unmarked, and I opened it. The pages were filled with tables, call numbers, annotations in tiny type. My vision blurred. I blinked hard, leaning closer, trying to anchor myself. The entries swam like fish, shifting when I tried to focus. I flipped forward. There was a page, a single page, on which the text did not shift. It held steady long enough for me to read a line. The library you seek is the one you carry. I laughed quietly because, of course, my mind or the book or the universe would offer me a sentence that sounded like a quotation from an imaginary philosopher. My laughter died when I realized my hands were trembling. I closed the book and hugged it briefly against my chest the way you might hug something you've found after years of looking. Then practicality, that cruel guardian of adult life, tapped me on the shoulder. If this was real, if the book was truly in Doe, then I needed to check it out. I needed to take it home, to put it on my desk, to prove to myself that I had not lost my mind. I turned toward the circulation desk, already rehearsing what I would say. I imagined the librarian scanning the barcode, the satisfying beep, the stamped due date. I imagined walking out of Doe with the book under my arm like a captured fugitive. Halfway down the aisle, my pocket felt wrong. You know that sensation, the sudden awareness of absence, of something you assume is there but is not. I patted my jacket, checked my other pocket, my bag. No wallet, no keys, no library card. I stopped dead, the book heavy in my hands, and felt a wave of disgust so intense it was almost comic. Of all the mistakes a person could make, forgetting a library card is minor. Yet in that moment it felt like fate mocking me. I stood there in the stacks, the book in my hands, and considered my options. I could carry it to the circulation desk and ask to check it out with my student ID. I could perhaps ask them to hold it behind the desk until I retrieved my card. I could photograph the pages, take notes, do anything to secure evidence. But the rational part of my mind, the part trained by years of institutional rules, insisted that I should not draw attention to the book. That if I spoke its title aloud in the wrong place, something would happen. The book would vanish. Someone would laugh. My colleagues would hear and treat it as a symptom rather than a discovery. So I did the simplest, stupidest thing. I returned the book to the shelf, and I slid it back between its neighbors with a reverence that bordered on apology. I touched the spine once more, as if sealing a pact. "I'll be back tomorrow," I whispered, and hated myself immediately for the melodrama. Then I left Doe and walked home with empty hands, my mind pounding with the certainty that I had just made the kind of error one makes in myths. In myths, the hero always fails to seize the object when it first appears. The hero hesitates, looks away, forgets the necessary token. The object is snatched back by whatever force governs such things. The rest of the story is punishment for that hesitation. I slept poorly that night. In the roundabout, Hollis looked at me with an expression that might have been pity if his face were capable of it. "You saw it," he said. "Yes." "And you didn't take it." "I couldn't," I said, furious with myself even in the dream. "I forgot my card." Hollis's eyes flicked to my hands. "You always have a card," he said softly. I looked down. In my dream, my hand held a thin rectangle of paper, not plastic, not my Berkeley ID, a card with a black border and gold lettering. It read, "Patron, Night Libraries." Underneath, in smaller print, "Valid until waking." I woke with my heart racing, my mouth dry, and my real library card sitting on my desk where I had left it days ago, as if mocking me with its ordinary plasticity. 4. The shelf that was no longer there. The next morning I went to Doe as if fleeing a crime scene. I did not stop for coffee. I did not check email. I walked briskly across campus, the winter air biting my cheeks, and climbed the library steps with the urgency of someone who expects the building to vanish if he looks away. I entered the stacks. I went straight to the aisle. The shelf was there. It curved outward slightly. My pulse jumped. I stepped closer. The black spine was gone. I stared. I scanned the neighboring titles as if the book might have disguised itself, changed its name, shifted a few inches. I checked above, below, left, right. I ran my hand along the row, feeling for the coolness of that cover. Nothing. A hollow space remained where it had been, but even that felt uncertain. Perhaps there had never been a space. Perhaps my memory was the thing that was missing. I stood there for a long time, my breath loud in the quiet aisle, until a student passing behind me cleared his throat politely. I stepped aside, letting him reach for a volume, and realized with a jolt that I was blocking the shelf like a guard. I forced myself to move, to think. A book does not vanish from a shelf without leaving traces. If it had been checked out, the catalogue would show it. If it had been reshelved incorrectly, it might be nearby. If someone had taken it, it might be on a cart, awaiting sorting. I went to a catalogue terminal and typed the title. Nothing and no results. I tried without the. I tried with quotation marks. I tried partial phrases. Nothing. I felt a coldness spread in my chest. Maybe it was not in the catalogue because it was special, I told myself with desperate optimism. Perhaps it was part of a collection that didn't circulate, an archival item. Perhaps it was a phantom volume, an unprocessed donation. Perhaps I had misread the title. I went to the reference desk on the first floor where a librarian sat with the calm posture of someone who has answered every imaginable question. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice as if conspiratorial. "I'm looking for a book," I said. "I saw it yesterday in the stacks and it's not there today." "That happens," she said with a smile that suggested she had heard the phrase "not there today" more times than she could count. "It's called Catalogue of the Night Libraries," I said, feeling foolish and exhilarated saying it aloud. Her fingers moved over the keyboard. She searched. Her expression remained neutral. "I'm not seeing it in our catalogue," she said. That's strange. It could be that you misremembered the title, she offered gently, or that it was in transit, or sometimes people put books back in the wrong place. I know where it was, I said too sharply, then softened my tone. I mean, I'm certain of the location. She studied me for a moment, not unkindly. Do you have the call number? She asked. In my mind, the pages of the book flickered, tables shifting, numbers refusing to be copied. I had not written anything down. I had been too dazzled. No, I admitted. No. If you can tell me the subject area, we can try to narrow it down, she said. Or we can do a shelf read in that section. It's a catalogue, I said lamely, of libraries. She nodded as if that were a normal request. There are many catalogues, she said. Do you recall anything else? Author? Publisher? Year? No author. Her eyebrows lifted just slightly. No author. No. She typed again, perhaps searching by keyword rather than title. Nothing. I'm sorry, she said. I'm not finding it. But if you give me your email, I can follow up. We can also check in Melville, the UC-wide catalogue. Melville, the great web of all UC library holdings. If the book existed in any official sense, it would likely appear there. She searched. Nothing. I watched the screen as if my gaze could force the record into existence. Nothing. A laugh threatened to bubble up, half hysteria, half disbelief. The librarian's calm face anchored me. Could it be, I asked, that it was a temporary item, a display, something that isn't in the system? It's possible, she said, but in the stacks, that would be unusual. Unusual. Yes, that was the point. I thanked her and walked away with the numbness of someone whose evidence has been confiscated. I returned to the aisle and stared at the shelf again, as if staring hard enough might summon the book back. In detective stories, the moment a clue vanishes is the moment the real investigation begins. The universe, having teased you with evidence, now challenges you to prove you deserve it. I left the stacks with a vow I did not yet understand I was making. I would find it again. V. On Bibliophiles and the Gentle Madness. There is a romantic story academics tell about themselves, that we are seekers of knowledge, lovers of truth, humble servants of the archive. We like to imagine our devotion to books is noble, but books inspire in us not only nobility, they inspire greed. A bibliophile claims to love books for what they contain. A bibliomaniac loves books as objects, as trophies, as talismans. The difference is often a matter of degree, like the difference between thirst and drowning. I had always believed myself immune to bibliomania. I did not collect first editions. I did not fetishize dust jackets. I annotated my paperbacks without guilt. I lent books to friends, sometimes losing them, and felt only mild irritation. And yet the moment I saw that dream book in dough, something in me snapped into a primitive certainty. Possess it, not read it, not study it, possess it. The book's absence after my failure felt less like a lost research opportunity and more like a personal theft, as if the universe had held out a hand and then slapped my fingers away. In the days that followed, I behaved outwardly like a reasonable scholar. I attended meetings, I taught my classes, I nodded at colleagues, I answered emails with polite phrases. I smiled when students asked questions. Inside, I was a man with a missing object lodged under his ribs. At night, the bookstores grew sharper, as if my obsession had increased the resolution of my dreams. The arcade's fluorescent lights buzzed louder. The conservatory's humidity clung to my skin. The ash annex's soot stained my fingertips more vividly. The roundabout, however, became unbearable. Every night I walked to my favorite shelf. Every night I found the catalogue of the night libraries exactly where it had always been, its gold title mocking me with its consistency. In the dream, it never vanished. Only in the waking world did it elude me. I began to question the direction of causality. Was the dream book leaking into reality, or had reality briefly aligned with my dream? Was I dreaming of a book that existed somewhere in the library, and my unconscious had led me to it? Or was the appearance in dough a hallucination conjured by my desire? I began to keep a notebook beside my bed. Each morning I wrote down everything I could remember, the order of bookstores, the faces of patrons, the placement of shelves. I drew diagrams of the roundabout's rings. I tried to capture the exact curvature of my favorite shelf, translating the sensation of my palm against wood into a crude sketch. The notebook filled quickly. My handwriting became smaller, more frantic. I began to include footnotes to myself, cross-references between dreams, hypotheses as if I were writing an academic article on my own madness. Note, Hollis uses phrase valid until waking, suggests link between patronage and consciousness. Compare Ash Annex keyring to Do master keys. Possible symbolic overlap. Title appears stable. Gold letters unchanged. Suggests anchor object. During the day, I returned to Do repeatedly. I checked the shelf. I walked adjacent aisles. I searched carts. I hovered near the reshelving area like a vulture. I began to recognize the staff. I nodded too often. I smiled too brightly. I could feel myself becoming in their eyes the kind of patron who would later be described as a little odd. One afternoon, I asked a circulation assistant, casually, whether there had been any recent reclassifications in that section. She frowned. Not that I know of. What about missing books? I asked. Lost volumes? We have some, sure, she said, but we usually have records. Records. Always records. The library, like any institution, trusted its paperwork more than its patrons' memories. I began to suspect the book existed in a space outside record-keeping. That suspicion was both terrifying and exhilarating. Scholars, trained to worship evidence, are nonetheless seduced by the idea of the undocumented. The lost manuscript, the suppressed text, the book that slips through catalogues like a fish through nets. Such things are the stuff of legends, and legends are often the private fuel of academic life. In my graduate seminars, we spoke of Borges, the blind librarian who imagined infinite shelves, the man who wrote of a library containing every possible book. We spoke of that vision with admiration, as if it were merely a metaphor. Now the metaphor had teeth. 6. The dream librarians begin to intervene. The bookstores of the night had always seemed indifferent to my waking life. They existed on their own schedule. They welcomed me with familiar routine and then vanished at dawn. After the book disappeared from Do, that indifference changed. In the arcade, Mr. Klein began to address me without my prompting. One night, as I passed the reference desk, he said, "You have been careless." I stopped. In what way? You saw the title in daylight, he said, as if reciting a known fact, and you left it. I couldn't, I began, and the excuse felt pathetic even in my mouth. Mr. Klein tapped a finger on the desk. You people always believe the rules of your institutions apply here, he said, as if the dream cares about your plastic card. It wasn't a rule, I protested. It was reality. I needed my card. Mr. Klein's mouth twitched. Perhaps it was an almost smile. Reality, he repeated, tasting the word like something dubious. In the conservatory, the woman with graphite-stained hands slid me an index card without my asking. On it, in neat handwriting, she had written, "The missing book is not missing. It is relocated." On the back, "Where do books go when you are not looking?" In the Ash Annex, the elderly librarian with the keys watched me approach and shook her head slowly, as if I were a child about to touch a hot stove. You think, she said, that because you have found it once, you are owed it. It's not about being owed, I snapped. She lifted a keyring, letting it jingle softly. Everything is about being owed, she said. That is what debt feels like. That is what desire feels like. In the cartographer's shop, the whispering librarian handed me a map. It was not of a country. It was not of a city. It was a map of a library. Not Doe, not Moffat, not any floor plan I recognized. It showed circular rings, concentric shelves, a central desk, an unmistakable diagram of the roundabout, and in the third ring, at the west point, a small mark. When I looked up to ask what it meant, the librarian was gone. Only the map remained, fluttering slightly in an air that smelled of salt. That night in the roundabout, Hollis did not wait for me to reach the desk. He met me halfway between rings, intercepting me like a guard. "You are making noise," he said. "I'm looking for a book." "You are looking for a key," he said, "and keys do not like to be found." "What are you talking about?" My voice echoed slightly in the circular space. Hollis's gaze flicked toward my favorite shelf. "The catalogue is not a book you check out," he said. "It is a book that checks you." I laughed bitterly. "That sounds like something you'd read on a poster in a philosophy department." He did not smile. "And yet," he said, "you are the one who came back." I stepped past him, ignoring the warning, and reached the shelf. The black spine waited. The gold letters gleamed. I pulled it free and opened it with a kind of angry reverence, as if daring it to resist me. The tables shifted. The entries swam. I flipped pages faster, searching for stability, for a foothold. Then suddenly an entry held still. It read, DOEMEMORIALLIBRARYSTACKS SHELFCURVATURESUBTLESTATUSINTRANSIT. Below it in smaller print, borrower present, borrower unprepared. I felt my stomach drop. I looked up. Hollis was watching me from a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "You see?" he said softly. "It knows." I woke with the image of that entry burned into my mind, and for the first time I understood. The dream book was not merely appearing in my dreams, it was tracking me. 7. A scholar learns to be a detective. If you cannot find a book by searching shelves and catalogues, you do what scholars have always done. You expand your definition of evidence. I began with the obvious. I checked every UC Berkeley library catalogue I could access. I searched not only by title but by keywords. Night, libraries, catalogue, dream, Onero, nocturnal. I searched in variant spellings, British and American, nothing. Then I broadened to WorldCat, to interlibrary systems, to digital databases, nothing. I began to suspect that the book's title might be false, an alias. Books, like people, can have multiple names, translations, alternate titles, series headings. Perhaps Catalogue of the Night Libraries was what my dream mind called it, but the waking world knew it differently. So I searched by description: black cover, gold lettering, no author. That, of course, was useless. Half the world's serious books match that description. Libraries are full of black spines that look like they contain secrets. Then I tried a different approach. I went to the place where libraries keep their older memories, the card catalogue. Doe, like many institutions, had mostly digitized its holdings. But remnants remained. Wooden drawers, yellowed cards, the smell of old glue. These catalogues are not merely tools. They are artifacts of a time when librarians physically wrote the world into existence. I spent an afternoon pulling drawers. I slid my fingers along cards with titles that sounded like spells. I found entries for books long since lost, with handwritten notes. Missing, withdrawn, sent to storage. I found cards with stamps from decades ago, evidence of bureaucratic life. At first I found nothing. Then, in a drawer whose label had worn away, I found a card that made my throat tighten. The type was crisp, not handwritten. The cardstock was slightly darker than the others, as if aged differently. The title read, Catalogue of the Night Libraries. No author, no publisher. Under call number, instead of a standard classification, there was a string of letters and numbers that did not match any system I knew. And under notes, in faint pencil, someone had written, Do not circulate. My hands shook so badly I had to grip the edge of the drawer. This was evidence. Physical, undeniable. The card existed. The library had, at some point, acknowledged the book. I carried the card, carefully as if it might disintegrate, to the reference desk. I did not remove it. I simply brought the drawer like a desperate child bringing proof of a found insect. The librarian on duty that day was different from the one I had spoken to before. He wore a blue shirt and had the patient eyes of someone who enjoyed puzzles. I found this, I said, trying to sound casual and failing. He leaned over the drawer, his eyebrows lifted. Well, he said, that's interesting. You see it, I said. Yes, he said, turning the card slightly. It's not in our digital catalogue. "Can you tell me what it means?" I asked. "This call number, it doesn't look like anything?" He frowned. "It doesn't," he agreed. "It might be an internal classification, or an old one, or, honestly, it might be a mistake. A mistake that says, 'Do not circulate'?" He hesitated, then glanced around, lowering his voice. "Sometimes," he said, "libraries have items that are not meant for general access, special collections, restricted materials, things that are complicated." Complicated how? He gave me a look that was, I realized, the look librarians give patrons who are close to crossing from curiosity into trouble. "I can ask someone in technical services," he said, "or in Bancroft. Bancroft, the archive, the place where rare books and manuscripts are treated like sacred objects." "Please," I said too eagerly. He took my information. He photographed the card. He promised, professionally, cautiously, to look into it. I left the library in a state of grim triumph. I had not found the book, but I had found its shadow. And in detective work, a shadow is sometimes enough to prove a body exists. That night in the roundabout, Hollis greeted me with the faintest hint of amusement. "You went digging," he said. "I found a card," I replied. He nodded. "The library remembers," he said. "It always does, even when it pretends it doesn't." "So where is it?" I demanded. Hollis's gaze slid past me toward the rings of shelves that curved endlessly. "In transit," he said. "Between where and where?" He looked at me then directly, and for a moment his eyes seemed older than his face. "Between your worlds," he said. 8. Berkeley by day, Labyrinth by night. Once you begin to look for a pattern, the world becomes generous with them. I started noticing curved shelves everywhere in Berkeley. Not literal curves, though the old buildings had their architectural quirks, but the suggestion of curvature, the way streets looped, the way staircases doubled back, the way campus paths formed rings around lawns and fountains. I began to think of the university as a library itself, a collection of texts in human form, students moving in predictable circuits, professors shelved in departments, administrators acting as reference librarians for bureaucratic questions. It was, I knew, an overly literary metaphor. But metaphors are how obsession makes itself seem intelligent. I visited local bookstores in the waking world, places I had loved before the dream book consumed me. I walked Telegraph Avenue, stepping into the familiar smell of used books, the murmur of conversations, the creak of wooden floors. I half expected to see Mr. Klein behind a counter, or the conservatory librarian at a desk. Of course I didn't. But in one shop, as I ran my fingers along a shelf of old catalogues, I saw a black spine with gold lettering. My breath caught. I reached for it, and my hand closed on a different title. Catalogue of the Bancroft Collection, 1923. I laughed out loud, startling a nearby customer. False alarms became common. My mind began to interpret every black spine as a potential apparition. I understood then why bibliomaniacs go bankrupt. The desire to find a particular book makes you see it everywhere, like a lover's face in crowds. The librarian who had promised to ask Bancroft emailed me 2 days later. His message was polite, professional. He said they had no record of the book in Bancroft's holdings. The call number did not match any known system. The card might be a misfiled joke, a placeholder, an anomaly from a cataloging transition. In other words, no. I stared at the email until the words blurred. Then I did what any desperate scholar does when institutions fail him. I decided to break the rules. Not dramatic rules. No alarms, no lockpicking. Just the smaller rules that govern access and permission. I returned to Doe late in the evening near closing when the library grew quieter. I lingered until staff began to make their rounds, reminding students to pack up. I waited until the last stragglers left. Then, when the guards' attention shifted, I slipped back toward the stacks. I did not intend to stay after hours. I told myself I was simply checking the shelf one more time, one last look before leaving. But my feet carried me deeper, and the stacks, with their fluorescent hum, felt less like a public space and more like a private corridor. I found the aisle. The shelf curved outward as before. The space where the book had been remained filled with ordinary titles. I stood there frustrated and rested my forehead briefly against the spines, as if seeking comfort from their indifferent solidity. That was when I heard it. A sound so faint I almost dismissed it as imagination, the soft jingling of keys. My head snapped up. The sound came from farther down the aisle, around a bend where the stacks ended in a service corridor. Keys. In the ash annex, the elderly librarian's keys had made that same sound. I took a step, then another. The stacks seemed to stretch subtly the way hallways stretch in dreams. The fluorescent lights flickered just once, like a blink. The jingling continued. I followed it. At the end of the aisle, where in waking life there should have been a locked door with an authorized personnel only sign, there was a doorway I did not remember. No sign, no lock, just an opening into darkness. The air beyond it was cooler. My rational mind screamed at me to stop. This was trespassing, dangerous, absurd. But my obsession, the part of me that had been orbiting the dream book for months, stepped forward. I crossed the threshold. The doorway led into a narrow corridor lined with shelves. Not metal institutional shelves, but wooden ones, worn smooth by touch. The corridor curved. I walked, my footsteps muffled by carpet that had no place in Doe's utilitarian back passages. The air smelled faintly of oranges and old paper. The corridor opened into a circular room, the roundabout. Not the dream version, not exactly, but close enough that my heart lurched. The shelves formed rings. The desk sat at the center, and behind the desk sat Hollis. He looked up as if expecting me. "You're late," he said. My mouth went dry. This is impossible." He shrugged slightly. "Libraries specialize in the impossible," he said. "It's why you love them." I stared, trying to make sense of the room's physics. The lighting was softer than Doe's, as if lit by lamps rather than fluorescence. The shelves had that subtle outward bow, as if each ring were breathing. "This is in Doe," I said, not a question but an accusation. "It's adjacent," Hollis corrected. "Adjacent to what?" He tapped the desk lightly. "To your insistence," he said. "To your error. To your forgetting." My anger flared. "Don't turn my mistake into a mystical lesson." Hollis's eyes held mine. "All mistakes are lessons," he said. "You just don't always like the curriculum." I stepped toward my favorite shelf, not daring to look away. The black spine waited, as always. Catalogue of the night libraries. My hand hovered over it. I felt suddenly the weight of my desire, the heat of it, the way it had narrowed my days, colonized my thoughts, turned me into a man who sneaked into libraries after hours. Was this what the book wanted? To lure me into a place where ordinary rules didn't apply? I looked back at Hollis. "If I take it," I said slowly, "what happens?" Hollis did not answer immediately. He watched me the way a librarian watches a patron reaching for a fragile manuscript. "Do you remember," he asked, "what bibliomania is?" "It's an illness," I said, defensive. "A collecting fever." "It's a belief," he corrected, "that the book will complete you. That possession will cure emptiness." "I just want to read it." Hollis's mouth twitched again, another almost smile. "You always say that," he said, "and then you want to keep it." I swallowed. "What happens?" I repeated. Hollis leaned forward slightly. "If you take it," he said, "you will check it out, and it will check you out. That doesn't mean anything." "It means," he said gently, "that you will not be able to return it." My fingers brushed the gold letters. I thought of Borges again, the man who imagined infinite libraries and wrote of books that devour their readers. I thought of the Library of Babel, where every possible book exists, including the one that explains your life and the one that lies about it. In such a library, meaning is a rare commodity. The temptation is not merely to read, but to find the one book that will make everything cohere. Was this that book? Or was that desire itself the trap? I pulled the volume free. It was heavier here in this room that felt more real than dream, but less real than Doe. The weight pressed into my palms like a warning. I carried it to the desk. Hollis watched without moving. "There's no scanner," I said, absurdly. Hollis reached into a drawer and pulled out a stamp. Not a Berkeley stamp, not an official seal. A stamp with a simple design, a circle within a circle like the rings of the roundabout. He opened the book to the inside cover and stamped it once. The ink was gold. Dew upon waking. My throat tightened. "I'm awake," I said. Hollis looked at me with something like sadness. "Are you?" he asked. I felt the room tilt, just slightly, as if the floor had become a ship's deck. The shelves seemed to breathe. The air tasted of oranges and smoke. Panic rose in my chest. I slammed the book shut. "I can't," I began. Hollis's voice cut through my panic. "You came for it," he said. "You broke rules for it. You chased it through catalogues. You dreamed it into daylight." "Yes," I whispered. "And now you're afraid of what it costs." I stared at the book in my hands. The gold title gleamed, indifferent. In that moment, the entire mystery shifted. It was no longer simply about finding the book. It was about what it meant that I wanted it so badly, about what kind of person I became when a book refused to be mine. I thought of all the ordinary books I had neglected while pursuing this phantom, the texts my students struggled with, the manuscripts waiting patiently in archives, the books on my own shelves at home, unread like quiet reproaches. My obsession had turned the world into one missing spine. I set the book down on the desk. "I'm not ready," I said, the words tasting like defeat. Hollis nodded as if he had expected this. He lifted the stamp again, and with the same calm motion he stamped a second mark, this time on a slip of paper. He slid the slip across the desk toward me. It was a checkout receipt. The title was printed in gold, Catalogue of the Night Libraries. Under it, borrower, blank, due upon waking. "Take that," Hollis said. "What is it?" "Proof," he said, "or bait, or a reminder, whichever you need." I took the slip. It felt warm between my fingers, unlike the book's cool cover. When I looked up, Hollis was no longer behind the desk. The room dimmed, the shelves blurred. I woke in my bed, my heart pounding, my hands clenched around something. I opened them. A small piece of paper lay crumpled in my palm, a checkout receipt printed in gold ink, smelling faintly of oranges and smoke. There was no barcode, no library name, just the circle within circle stamp and the words, "Due upon waking." 9. The book that vanishes, the search that remains. The next day I went to Doe again, because of course I did. I brought my library card. I brought my ID. I brought my notebook, my receipt, my absurd evidence. I went to the shelf. The curvature was there, and the black spine was not. I asked librarians. I showed them the card catalogue entry I had photographed. I showed them the receipt and watched their expressions shift from professional patience to polite concern. One librarian suggested I might be experiencing stress. Another suggested sleep deprivation. A third, kinder than the rest, suggested I write down my dreams and talk to someone. No one suggested that the book might exist outside their systems. No one suggested that libraries might have doors that appear only for those who are desperate enough to see them. I stopped asking. Instead, I began to live with the absence. Not comfortably, not wisely, but with the resigned endurance one develops when confronted with a mystery that refuses to resolve. At night, the bookstore still welcomed me. The arcade still pulled me forward with its draft. Mr. Klein still watched with his unreadable gaze. The conservatory still breathed humidity. The graphite-stained librarian still slid me cards with cryptic warnings. The cartographer's shop still offered maps that fluttered like living things. The ash annex still smelled of smoke, and its patrons still stared at pages they did not turn. The roundabout still held my favorite shelf, and the catalogue still sat there, black spine and gold title, as if it had never flirted with reality, as if my daylight encounter had been a hallucination. Sometimes in the dream I would walk to the shelf and simply stand there without touching the book. Hollis would watch from the desk. "You're learning," he would say. "What?" I would ask. He would not answer, and perhaps that was the lesson. That libraries, like mysteries, do not exist to be solved so much as inhabited. My waking life began to regain its texture. I returned to my work. I read ordinary books with renewed tenderness, as if making amends. I taught Borges again, but this time when we discussed his infinite library, I felt a chill of recognition rather than aesthetic admiration. I did not tell my students about the dream book. Some experiences cannot be shared without becoming ridiculous. Yet the search changed me in subtle ways. When I walked through Doe, I began to notice shelves, slight sags and curves, the human evidence of weight and time. I began to see librarians not merely as staff, but as guardians of thresholds. I began to treat the stacks with the respect one gives to labyrinths. Occasionally, when I sat at my desk late at night, the gold ink receipt would catch the light. Due, upon waking. I kept it tucked inside my copy of Borges's collected stories like a bookmark in a book about impossible books. Sometimes I would take it out and hold it between my fingers, feeling the faint raised texture of the stamp. Was it proof? Was it bait? Was it a reminder? I thought often of the moment in the stacks when I had held the dream book in my hands, real and cool and heavy, and then slid it back into place because I'd forgotten my library card. A mistake so small it was almost comical. Yet my life's most persistent mystery now hinged on that trivial omission, like a fate written on a clerical oversight. It occurred to me months later that perhaps I had misinterpreted the moment. Perhaps the universe had not punished me for forgetting my card. Perhaps the forgetting was the universe's way of saving me. Because what if I had checked it out? What if I had walked out of Doe with the catalogue under my arm? Would the book have remained a book, an object I could read, cite, and shelve? Or would it have expanded, like a seed, into something that consumed the boundaries of my life? Books, after all, do not merely sit on shelves. They rearrange minds. They build rooms inside us. Some books are so powerful that they rewrite the architecture of the reader. Perhaps the catalogue of the night libraries was such a book, a text too dangerous to possess, because possession would mean becoming its territory. Or perhaps that was simply the rationalization of a man who had failed to seize what he wanted. Bibliophilia and bibliomania are separated by a thin line, and that line is often drawn in hindsight. I do not know even now which side of it I stand on, and I only know this. Every night I still go to the bookstores of my dreams. Every night I walk the familiar circuits, feeling the curvature of shelves under my fingers, recognizing patrons whose faces have become as intimate as colleagues, nodding to reference librarians who know my habits better than my friends do. Every night I stand before my favorite shelf. The black spine waits. The gold title gleams. Catalogue of the night libraries. Sometimes I reach for it, sometimes I don't. And every morning I wake with the faint ache of a mystery unsolved, the kind of ache that, if you are a scholar, you learn to live with. Because scholarship itself is a way of haunting. We pursue texts, trace references, follow footnotes down corridors, and more often than not, what we find is not an answer, but another question, another door, another shelf that curves slightly outward, as if inviting us to lean closer. Once, recently, I returned to Doe on a grey afternoon, not searching, not hunting, just wandering, letting my mind rest among the stacks. I turned down an aisle at random and saw at the end a small service corridor I did not remember. For a moment, I smelled oranges. For a moment, I heard keys jingling softly. My heart sped up. I took a step forward. Then a student pushed a cart past me, laughing with a friend, and the moment broke. The corridor was just a corridor. The air smelled of dust and fluorescent heat. The sound of keys was only someone's lanyard. I stood there, embarrassed by my own hope, and then, without meaning to, I laughed. Because the truth, the simplest truth, is this: the dream book is not only a book, it is the search. It is the crooked little hunger that makes us walk aisles with our heads tilted, reading spines like prayers. It is the part of us that believes there is, somewhere, a volume that will explain the labyrinth. And maybe that is the most Borges-like thing of all, that the library is infinite, the book is always missing, and the detective, me, you, any reader, keeps walking anyway, guided by a title stamped in gold somewhere behind the eyes, due not upon waking, but upon the last page we ever turn. Write a compelling teaser to this story. He has always dreamed in libraries, not vague, dissolving dreams, but precise ones. 5, sometimes 6 bookstores he returns to every night, where the shelves curve in familiar ways and the librarians know him by habit rather than name. In those nocturnal stacks, he hunts for books the way others hunt for answers until one volume begins to follow him, a black-spined catalogue with gold lettering that lists libraries no one admits exist. Then one afternoon, in the stacks at UC Berkeley, he finds it. The same title, the same weight in his hands. And in a moment so small it feels meaningless, he makes a mistake, one forgotten library card, and the book vanishes from the waking world. What follows is not a chase across cities, but across thresholds. Card catalogues that remember what computers deny, librarians who speak in warnings instead of rules, corridors that curve where they shouldn't, and a realization that some books do not want to be owned. As obsession sharpens into investigation, the scholar discovers that bibliophilia has a shadow and that libraries, like dreams, keep accounts of what we take and what we leave behind. The Dream Book is a literary mystery about forbidden catalogues, nocturnal bookstores, and the dangerous hope that somewhere there exists a single book capable of explaining the labyrinth, if you are willing to pay the price of finding it.